Alberta Premier Daniel Smith has been dishing out a number of mandate letters to her ministers. Of note is the letter that was sent to Dan Williams, the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us from our provincial capital. Tyler, the province really needs to get a handle on the drug crisis here in Alberta, as overdose deaths have been climbing once again. Do you think this letter to Minister Williams really specifies that?
Well, the letter, I think, largely looks at a sort of steady as she goes approach. The United Conservative Party has been very keen on what it's calling a recovery-oriented approach to the drug crisis. So instead of focusing on things like harm reduction, supervised injection sites, safer supply of narcotics, they're really focusing on trying to get people into treatment. And so you've seen a lot of that in the way they've talked about the drug crisis in the last few years. They've talked about putting a lot of money into treatment centers. They floated the idea of involuntary treatment for folks who are suffering from drug addiction. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of indication that they are, going to aggressively, change their strategy on this. There was a period of time there when it looked like this recovery model was actually working quite well. Drug deaths and overdoses were down across the province. But this sort of also coincided with the pandemic. This also coincided with sort of a nationwide drop in overdose deaths. And they've sort of since started to climb back up to the point where April 2023 was the worst month on record. So, I think probably what we're going to see on that file more than anything is a sense of acceleration on some of this stuff. There's a whole pile of community treatment centers and things like that have been announced. And so I think probably we're going to see a big push here on construction and staffing and some of those things. But my read on the situation is that there isn't, an aggressive change in the government's strategy. But I think there is certainly an acknowledgement within the government that the numbers are not now trending the way the government had thought and would have hoped.
And you know what? It's not just an Alberta problem. We're seeing this in other provinces as well, including British Columbia, which is setting record overdose deaths right now. It's just really sad what's transpiring. Tyler, we saw a rare display of unity involving the mayors of Calgary, Edmonton, and Seniors, Community and Social Services Minister Jason Nixon, who wrote a letter to Federal Housing Minister Sean Fraser. Now, the topic of discussion, the lack of affordable housing here in our province.
That's right. And so there's this fund called the Rapid Housing Fund that is supposed to offer out money to, get affordable housing built quickly. And there's been, I think, 3 rounds of funding dished out from the feds to around the country. And Alberta, didn't get very much this time around. I think 39 projects had applied for that funding, and 6 of them got funding. So, that was, and, if you look at the entire sum of money that the federal government dished out, I think Alberta got about 2.5% of that money, and we're about 12% of the country's population. So, this letter is sort of raising that with the federal government, saying, hey, look, why is this not, a proportional distribution of money? There's maybe the sense politically that it's going to more liberal-friendly areas. But, it's a bit of a complicated one, right? Because Alberta's housing, while it's expensive and while there's a lack of affordable housing, is still a heck of a lot cheaper than it is in Toronto or Victoria or Vancouver. So, maybe that's a little bit of the logic that the federal government's going with here. But at any rate, Nixon, Jyoti Gondek, and Amarjeet Sohi all sort of on the same page on this one. Perhaps this will usher in a golden age of municipal-provincial relations, but I somehow doubt that.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau shuffled his cabinet recently, Tyler. Now, what was really interesting is that only one Alberta minister is in cabinet, and that's Randy Boissonnault from Edmonton. The other Liberal MP from Alberta, George Chahal, was shut out. How do you think this will really impact Alberta's relationship with Ottawa moving forward?
Well, it's hard to say, I mean, first of all, there's only 2 Liberal MPs in the province, so not a whole lot of selection for Trudeau to choose from here. So would another minister from Calgary, say, have, improved relations between Alberta and the government in Ottawa? Pretty hard to say, probably unlikely. But, maybe the relevant thing is that Calgary doesn't have a representative in cabinet. Alberta perhaps does by way of Randy Boissonnault, but Calgary certainly doesn't. So, I think there's an attitude in some circles that this was a bit of a snub that Alberta's not getting sort of due representation in cabinet. But I don't know if the Liberals care all that much. They don't need votes in Alberta to win the next election, really. This is not, I think, the place where a lot of the energy is going to be focused in the next year and a half or whenever the next election comes, because we don't vote Liberal, so it's a bit of a cat and a mouse thing, which comes first. But nonetheless, there's a lot of interesting stuff that happened in that cabinet shuffle, or didn't happen, is maybe more to the point, that does, I think, affect Alberta's relationship with the Liberal government. And in particular, that's that Stephen Guilbeault stays on as Minister of the Environment and Jonathan Wilkinson stays on as Minister of Natural Resources. And obviously, energy and the environment are sort of the two big files that Alberta's, at loggerheads with the federal government. And so this, I think, probably signals that the federal government is not really planning on changing its tack on the energy file or the environment file. And so, there's the benefit of the fact that there's relationships that have been built and maintained between our provincial government and Guilbeault and Wilkinson. But, if anyone was hoping for a new minister in charge of the environment that was going to, be far more amenable to negotiating with the provinces, I don't think that's the way the Liberals are signaling that they're going.
What's the latest with the relationship between Alberta and Ottawa when it comes to the just transition phase? You know how Stephen Guilbeault, Justin Trudeau says we want to phase a lot of people out of the energy sector, oil and gas, into more environmentally friendly or more green technology, where Daniel Smith has really pushed back. What's the latest with that?
Well, the interesting development here is that Randy Boissonnault actually got a promotion within cabinet. He moved from the tourism ministry to employment, workforce development, and official languages. Bit of a grab bag of ministries for Boissonnaut there, but workforce development, I suspect, is going to have a role in this just transition plan, which they've rebranded it as I think the Sustainable Jobs Plan. So it's going to be interesting to see what role Boissonnaut plays in that. Will it be more palatable to have an Albertan talking about those things to Albertans? It might help a little bit. Perhaps better than Stephen Guilbeault coming from Montreal to talk about it. But I don't think there has been a whole pile of, let's say, softening on either side on that file. I think that there's probably a little bit of room for negotiation on some of the other contentious parts of the relationship. The net zero electricity grid, for example, the emissions cap from oil and gas companies. Maybe those things are sort of negotiable at some point. But in terms of workforce development, I don't get the sense that the Liberals are all that open to changing it. And the other sort of thing about that, I know I'm rambling on about it, but it is important, is their strategy seems to be in some ways to go directly to workers, to have worker sort of councils and things like that to discuss this. So to some extent, a cynic maybe could argue that they were trying to sort of sidestep the provincial government and take that right to the folks that'll be affected.
Tyler, the plan for Alberta to replace the RCMP with its own provincial police force appears to be dead. Can you explain why?
Yeah, it's a very weird one because the government sunk a lot of political capital into this over the last couple of years. But the mandate letters, as we talked about earlier, they've been sort of coming out over the last few weeks, and the mandate letter to the Justice Minister doesn't mention an Alberta provincial police force. So the minister has said that, this is a thing that will be studied and recommendations will come back to the cabinet and that sort of stuff. So, it's out there a little bit, but it certainly does not seem like this is a priority for the provincial government at this time, which is interesting because, the Kenney government put quite a lot of resources into it. They had a whole study done that sort of looked at staffing and expenses and how it would be rolled out and all that sort of stuff, and quite a detailed plan, I thought, on how that could be accomplished. But it was never really that popular, right? People in Alberta didn't particularly want it. Even if they don't particularly like the RCMP, they were skeptics of another program coming in. The rural municipalities in particular didn't like it. There were some cost concerns there. They had existing relationships with folks in the RCMP. So it would have been, I think, a pretty hard sell for Albertans. And it does appear that this government is backing off on it at this point.
Yeah, there's the cost involved as well. Like we talked about, it'd be very costly converting it to the provincial police force. Speaking of cost, Daniel Smith, I guess, has been talking about potentially putting in a bid for the Commonwealth Games for 2030. along with the mayors of both Calgary and Edmonton, but that could be also quite costly as well. Is it needed right now? Is this what our province really wants and needs?
Yeah, it's a good question, because especially in the context of this other discussion that's been happening about whether or not there should be referenda, I suppose, of whenever international events are hosted by Alberta cities. It's sort of unclear, I think, whether or not this might go to a referendum. I don't get the sense that it could, but it's an interesting thing because, of course, those sort of events do allow for infrastructure to be built. The good example is the Canada Line in Vancouver during the 2010 Olympics. I believe Edmonton's Commonwealth Stadium was built for the Commonwealth Games in 1976, maybe is the number that comes to mind. So,
Well,
in
the
that
speed
sense,
skating ovals in Calgary back in the 88
yeah,
Winter Olympics as well, right?
yeah, and you've got the Calgary Olympic Park, you've got Nikiska ski area. So there is stuff that can get done because of these events, but at the same time, how much money is going to be forked out by the provincial government, by municipal governments? Are Albertans going to want that? These things don't ever seem to be super, super popular. They do seem to be a bit of a hard sell. So I guess we'll have to see. It's an interesting file, and it's going to be even more interesting, I think, if it goes to a referendum.
Now, speaking of money, the Marda Loop Medical Clinic in Calgary decided against charging membership fees in exchange for faster access to a family doctor. Was it the threat of an audit by the province which kind of changed their minds? And how common of a practice is this really?
It does seem like the federal or the provincial government, I should say, sort of put a stop to it. There were some threats to withhold fee payments and things like that. The scheme itself is, it's relatively simple. It was a membership fee of, I think it was about $2,000 for an individual, up to $4,000 for a family each year, and it would basically get expedited access to the doctor. So contrary to what some people have claimed, you did not have to pay to see a family doctor. Really, not directly, anyways. But it was super controversial, and actually another show of unity. Sort of Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley both more or less on the same page on this. Although Rachel Notley certainly put a lot of effort into trying to make this out to be the UCP's fault. Now, as for the model itself, it's really common in the United States, where you get a whole basket of healthcare services for your membership fee. It's less common here, but it does exist. I think I looked into it last week, and there were a couple dozen clinics across the country, I think it was, that sort of did this model. But you can see. I'd be ticked if my family doctor sent me a letter saying I'd have to pay $2,000 to go see him. So it did sort of end that immediate controversy, but this is a strategy and a funding model, I guess, that exists elsewhere. And part of the reason people do it, is that running a physician clinic is, it's expensive. You get your payments from the province, but is that going to cover your staff, your rent, your utilities, yada yada yada? So it is a way to sort of help keep the doors open, but clearly a bit of a negative public reaction to that.
Tyler, Premier Danielle Smith says she's skeptical that more insurance companies are going to be leaving Alberta because of the affordability measures capping insurance rates. And our rates are some of the highest in the country here.
Yeah, and so this sort of rate cap came in, and insurance companies were sort of looking at it, and one insurance company, we don't know which insurance company it is. There's confidentiality rules apparently that prevent the government from saying which company it is, but they had about 0.5% of the market share, so maybe 16,000 people's auto insurance. And so they pulled out, and the question is, obviously, are other companies going to follow suit? And as you said, Danielle Smith doesn't seem to think that's going to happen. I guess if we have among the highest insurance rates in the country, is a cap really cutting into profits all that much? So, it does seem like a hurry up and wait. We'll wait and see kind of thing about what's going to happen with the insurance sector. And the government, I believe, has also committed to sort of going back and looking at the cap and reanalyzing, where it's at. So we might see some changes there that would make it a little more palatable to the insurance industry. But let me tell you, my insurance went up, and I was on the phone in a hot second to argue for it to go down.
Yeah, so did mine as well. And I also want to talk to you about my electricity rates, which have also gone up quite a bit here. The government of Alberta has launched an office to combat human trafficking. $4 million is going to be invested to liaise with other service groups to connect victims of trafficking to community supports. Now, we're seeing around, 350 incidents of human trafficking each year across Canada. And Tyler, that's 350 too many.
Yeah, so the statistics the government put out, about 350 per year, from 2011 to 2021. If you add up all of them, it was about 3,500. So, a nationwide problem, it seems. And so this office is, as you said, just sort of going to liaise with other organizations, because there are some groups that do a lot of work in that, on that particular issue. And it will be a way to sort of connect them with social services and other community supports. So obviously not up and running yet, but another sort of summer policy proposal and expenditure from the province here.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me.